important things. Friends, let us start with the discussion that we have initiated from the essay The Archetypes of Literature. We have seen yesterday that how Northrop Frye is trying to point out that what it means by literature and how criticism is, in a sense, essential to understand literature. And he has given certain terms to discuss, of which he says of pseudo proposition. And what is pseudo proposition? He has mentioned it very clearly. Even we find that how we deal with criticism, how we discuss criticism, how we even value and how we even understand criticism, because he mentions it clearly that the popularity or the hype or the importance of the book is naturally developed, increased by critics. And critics, when they build up this hype of certain book, Fry has given example of market, share market, and how critics feel that they can give certain life to the book, or they can make the book to be fall down from the market. This is what a common critic used to feel, and that's why he said these literary chit chats, they have defined and decided what exactly is the reputation of the poet, what exactly is the reputation of the poem. And Fry is trying to build up this momentum and trying to point out certain important aspect. Fry further in this essay discusses about how serious critics or a serious group of critics, how they talk about literature, what they feel about literature, what is their view about literature. Because when you are going to establish a new form of understanding, pointing out that criticism is the most important, you can say, tool to understand literature. If you want to understand literature, if you want to get literature, you require to have this particular criticism for your help, so that you can able to understand what literature, how literature is, and how it helps you to understand the things of life. Now, Fry says most of the, or otherwise you can say, more serious group of critics who say that the foreground of criticism is the impact of literature on the reader. Now, how you understand criticism, how you come to know about criticism. The foreground of literature is the impact of foreground of criticism is the impact of literature. First, we know about literature, and then we start to understand, then we start to know that okay, this is what the criticism is there. This is what a common perception about criticism. But the most serious critics used to say, group of critics used to say, that because you are having certain understanding of literature, that's why you can have an importance of criticism. If you read only criticism, you will not able to understand what that literature is all about. How can you say that you need to have already criticism known before going for certain important things, as it usually happens with most of us, that if you want to uh, watch any movie or if you want to watch any drama performance in a theater, you first of all go with a review that appears in the newspaper, to which we call it as criticism, which is not in fact. After going through the review or the review which is appearing on television, then you decide and plan that okay, this movie is good or this movie is bad without your own understanding. You develop your understanding on someone's saying. You develop your ideas, you develop your whole uh, understanding of the thing based on someone's understanding. You don't develop your own perception about that particular thing. And what Fry is interested in pointing out, that what serious groups of critics used to say, that the foreground of criticism is the impact of literature on the reader. Now, considering this argument, Fry is pointing out that let us keep the study of literature centripetal. And the base, the learning process on structural analysis of the literary work goes on itself. It naturally happens when you start to study, when you start to read literature. Literature is in the center from which the things are going out. It is again a very typical, you can say, term or word used in physics: centripetal force and centrifugal force. And Fry is saying that if you keep literature at centripetal, the study of literature centripetal, the learning process starts with the structural analysis of it. How will you understand that it is a poem? How will you understand that it is a drama? How will you understand that it is a sort of short story or it is a novel? Because you are familiar with a sort of structure of it. You are familiar with the structural analysis of that particular thing. And that's why Fry is saying if you keep all those things, the structural analysis of the literary work starts itself. The learning process is having its own understanding of that structural analysis. You need not to have any critic to say that this is the structure of this particular thing. You can understand it comfortably. You can know it comfortably. Now, the texture of any great work of art is complex. It is not simple. And most of the time, it is ambiguous. And when you try to unravel the complexities, when you try to understand the complexities, when you try to open up the complexities for the sake of understanding of that literature, we take support as much as possible from history and philosophy. We take support, we take the things from history and philosophy because as we please, we take that much support from history and philosophy to unravel the complexities of the literary work of art. And when you use this thing, when you use or when you take a support of history and philosophy, at that time your literature is or the subject of our study remains at center. To understand it, you are taking support of all those things. And when you're taking support of all those things, we are feeling that we can able to understand that particular subject comfortably. And please understand, my friends, this is the way that we used to study literature most of the time. Not all the time. Most of the time we used to study literature in this fashion by taking support from either history or philosophy. Entering into the biography, entering into the incidences, entering into the conditions of the work that the poet or the writer did, and we try to relate it with the historical events that took place. Either it is a biographical events or historical events or social events also based on history, or else to understand the wisdom of that writing we enter into the ideas of arenas of philosophy. We move to philosophy to understand all those things. And that's why you will find out, my friends, that literature, when it is in the center, when the subject of study is in the center, we are pleased to take support of history and philosophy. And if it does not, we may find that in our anxiety to write about literature, this anxiety we most of the time face in examination. If we don't, what we say, we have to understand this particular subject of literature, but when we are understanding the subject of literature, if you don't take support of history and philosophy, we feel that we are very much in trouble. We are not able to write down about literature, or we have what Fry is claiming, that we have forgotten how to read literature. We have forgotten how to read literature because we always used to feel, we always used to think that yes, without support of history, and remember one thing, my friend, you are not doing it consciously. The support of history and philosophy for unraveling the complexities of the subject of literature is not at all done particularly or consciously because we haven't trained in that fashion. The sort of criticism developed, the sort of branch of criticism as it develops, this branch of criticism made most of us to understand, most of us to follow that we need support of some other branches, other disciplines. Because to what sort of criticism Fry is pointing out is of new critics, new criticism. Because new criticism, which was very prominent, new criticism is interested in simply trying to seek the text meaning, how it speaks. It is concerned to the trace of paths that it relates with, how it achieves its orders, how it achieves harmony, and how it contains and restores irony, paradox, ambiguity, ambivalent in the text. This is how new critique is trying to find out. New criticism is not concerned with the context, because if you go for the earlier understanding of criticism, you will find out that there is most of the time the context that are provided to you. And Fry is claiming here that the new criticism has given a different dimension to understand literature. New criticism is simply talking about the text, talking about the meaning of the text, trying to build up the whole understanding as the text speaks for itself. It is not concerned with any sort of context. I'm talking it very broadly. I have not entered into deep about what new criticism talks about. It's a different topic to talk on. And Northrop Frye is mentioning that the only weakness in this approach, in this understanding of new criticism, this is what Frye says. The only weakness in this approach of new criticism is that it is conceived primarily as antithesis of centrifugal, antithesis of background criticism, antithesis of background criticism. That's why it has not, as I said, it has not taken into consideration the context. And that's why it lands in somewhat unreal dilemma. Because without context, you cannot understand the text. And context is somehow helping you to understand. And that's what he mentioned, that we take the support of history and philosophy to unravel the complexities of the great work of art, because that is a context available to you. You cannot unravel the things without knowing the context. And if you are trying to understand, as new criticism is pointing out, and that's what he said, this is a weakness of this particular approach, that it has primarily conceived that it is an antithesis to the centrifugal or background criticism, and so it lands with somehow unreal dilemma for the readers to understand the sort of internal and external relations. Friends, the power is now off of my house, so I may shift to, you can say, I may shift to the hotspot from my mobile, so it may take a time to shift from that. So if it breaks in between, please, for a moment, wait for a moment there because the power is off right now. Yeah. So we have to understand this important fact that what Fry is trying to bring up, that it will put us in some what unreal dilemma. Antitheses are usually resolved not by picking one side and refuting other side, and you can say that okay, I have resolved the antithesis. You cannot say like that. Antithesis can be resolved. Antitheses are usually resolved, not can. Not by picking one side and refuting other. You have to understand all the things to resolve the antithesis, or by making you cannot resolve it by making eclectic choice between what is good or what is bad, because you cannot say to resolve antithesis that I'll choose one side. You are not resolving it. You are being biased. What you have to do, but try to get past the antithetical way of stating the problem. You have to pass by how the problems have been stated there. You have to resolve it, not by choosing one side, but you have to understand all the things, and then you have to state the problem that what antithesis is trying to bring it out. Now, if you look at the historical or earlier way that how approaches in criticism appeared, you will find out, my friends, that the first effort of critical apprehension, the first effort of critical apprehension should take the form of rhetorical or structural analysis of the work of art. And if you carefully, or if you understand what Aristotle did, or what Aristotle wrote, and what we discussed in Poetics, how this whole structure of the work of art is discussed. Different six different what we say constituents of tragedy, and what are the parts of epic. We discussed all those things. And if you see it very carefully and understand it very critically about that particular thing, it was the first apprehension, it was the first way, structural analysis of work of art. From that you can find out, or even rhetorics. In the early Greek period, rhetorics was also a way of criticism. But purely structural approach has a sort of, you can say, limitations in criticism, as you will find out the limitations in biology. Because if you want to understand certain structure, the biology will give you the structure of it. structure of particular thing. It will not enter deep into it. Merely understanding structure doesn't mean that you understand all the aspect of that work of art or that work. It has got its limitation. It's okay that because of which you can able to understand that this is how thing this is how this thing means by. And that's why there are certain limitations to it. We have to understand these limitations. And itself, it is simply a discrete series of analysis merely based on the existence. It is based on existence of the literary structure. Because the analysis is based on merely literary structure, how can we able to enter, or how can we able to understand the literature, the great work of art thoroughly, the complexities of the work of art thoroughly? Now, if it is possible for you to remind or remember the poetics, what Aristotle taught, what Aristotle discussed. Has Aristotle resolved the complexities of any great tragedies? He has given simply structural analysis of tragedy. And that's why it is simply a discrete series of analysis based on the literary structure without developing any sort of explanation of how the structure came to be, what it was, and what its nearest relatives are. If you're talking about literature which is trying to point out the human relation, trying to give certain explanation about what it is based on, if you're discussing only on literary structure, okay, it will serve the purpose for you to understand what exactly means by this particular work of art. But this is not at all able to develop the explanation. Whether that work of art makes you, or whether that particular structural analysis makes you to understand that what is, how this literary work of art came into existence, how this structure was developed, what are the reasons for the development of this particular structure, or do we able to find out in the structure analysis what are the closest, you can say, nearest relatives of this particular structure. Structural analysis, what Fry claims, brings back rhetoric to criticism. Structural analysis brings back rhetorics to criticism. But we need a new poetics as well as along with rhetorics. This is what the development in Greek literature, Greek criticism. First was rhetorics, then Aristotle came with poetics. So that was a gradual development. So if structural analysis is bringing back rhetorics to the literature, then we require a new poetics that makes us to understand and to construct an attempt to construct a new poetics out of rhetorics can hardly avoid mere complications of rhetorical terms. It can hardly avoid the new or the form of complicated rhetorical terms and convert it into a sterile jargon. And this sterile jargon makes us to feel criticism something different, something difficult. And that's why Fry has given his understanding and solution to it by saying that what is at present missing from literary criticism is a coordinating principle. How to coordinate the things. The coordinating principle is missing from literature, missing from literary criticism. Biology is having a coordinating principle that theory of evolution is one of the most important principle into biology on which rest of the things are based on. Similarly, because theory of evolution in biology is a, you can say, sort of a coordinating theory. Literary criticism should have a coordinating principle, and it should have a central hypothesis. And this central hypothesis, which is like theory of evolution in biology, will help us to coordinate all the things. We are missing of this coordinating principle, a hypothesis. And such principle, though it would retain the centripetal perspective of analysis, though it will have a centripetal perspective of structural analysis, it would try to give the same perspective to other kinds of criticism too. But we are lacking of all those things. And that's why we should have to develop a sort of hypothesis. And Fry is insisting continuously on developing the hypothesis. He said the first postulate of this hypothesis is the same as that of any science, as you can have an hypothesis in science. Please remember the lectures that we had on research methodology. What we discussed about research methodology in the first semester, if you remember or if you remind the lectures that we had. We have to formulate a certain kind of hypothesis. Then and then you can able to reach. And the first postulate of this hypothesis that we require to develop in literary criticism is that of science. Same that in any kind of science we have this kind of hypothesis. That the assumptions of total coherence. Assumption of total coherence. Now the assumption refers to the science, the sort of assumption that science refers. If you have done any practicals in the lab, you consider certain things with you and trying to find out that okay, this is what we have considered and the thing which we are doing has to reach to this particular point. If I'm putting this acid on this litmus paper, if the color is changed, I can able to point out that this is alkali or alkaline. You assume certain things in science and then you proceed further. Similar in mathematics also, my friends. You consider x as one of the value and then move further to find out what exactly this x means by. That means you assumed certain things. And why you assume? The assumption of total coherence to bring out the things all together and try to understand the thing. So when you postulate any hypothesis, the first postulate of this hypothesis that we try to build up in understanding the criticism, the central hypothesis need to be built up that literary criticism is having a coordinating principle which is missing. This coordinating principle has to build up. And that's why he's saying the first postulate of this kind of hypothesis is the same as that of any science, and the assumption of total coherence that we want to come together and we have to solve, we have to understand the things. The assumption refers to the science. Please understand, it is not what science deals with. Don't be confused to it. Otherwise, we would have a common confusion that, okay, uh, then if you are talking about science, then why not to consider it in a scientific way or how the science deals with? No, we are referring to the science, not to what it deals with. We are simply referring that way, not how it deals with. A belief in an order of nature is an interference from the intelligibility of natural sciences. What are the different orders of nature? How do you come to know about this? How do you know these things? This come from the intelligibility that is provided to us by natural sciences. We can understand that order. And if the natural science or natural sciences ever completely demonstrate the order of nature, they would presumably exhaust their subject. So they are not demonstrating the complete order. They are simply giving you certain ideas, certain hints, certain way to understand the complete order of nature. If they are demonstrating each and everything, then they are exhausting their subject. Criticism as a science is totally intelligible. This is how Fry claims. Criticism is totally intelligible. And literature, as the subject of a science, is, so far as we know, an inexhaustible source of new critical discoveries. We have not discovered any new criticism out of it. It's inexhausted. And would be even if the new works of literature cease to be written in future, all the coming literature is inexhausted, surely will not be exhausted by many people, because we are not treating it as a science. And that's why when we are not treating it as a science, it would be difficult for us to find out certain new critical discoveries. Look out the approaches in criticism coming from, again, being a student from Indian background, again a student from the Middle East background, we can point out that we don't have any new discoveries of criticism from our side. Do we have? All the ideas, all the critical approaches, all the apprehensions developed in criticism or developed in understanding of criticism is either European or American. We don't even exhausted our literature to find out certain new critical discoveries. And if it is so, then the search of limiting principles in literature, search for limiting principle in literature, in order to discourage the development of criticism, is mistaken. This is what Fry is putting it very harshly, that we discourage the development of criticism because we understood the limiting principle in literature. Literature is having its own limitations. Um, I can say we decide it on our own, we finalize it on our own, we think that it is what literature is having its own limitations, and that's why we discourage it. If we say so, that critical discoveries, the sources are inexhaustible. The assertion that the critique should not look for more in a poem than the poet may safely be assumed to have been conscious of putting there is a common form of, you can say, fallacy of premature teleology. What we are considering, what we are asserting, again, time and again, we are pointing out time and again that critique should not look beyond the poem. Critique should talk about the poem, and he should consider and he should understand that what poet assumed to keep the things in the poetry, he should have been following the same. He should not go beyond that. And if you are doing this, Fry says that this is, so please understand, is to assert that critique should not look for a more in a poem than poet may assume to have been conscious of putting there. Poet consciously puts certain thing into poems, and that's why we should not look beyond that. That is, in a very simple word, you can say, a fallacy of premature teleology. And this is what usually happens when we try to criticize or try to use criticism. And it corresponds to the assertion that a natural phenomena is as it is possible, as it is there, because providence in its inscrutable wisdom made it so. Providence is making it. You want providence. You want to have something to be provided for you. And that's why why I'm coming Richards again and again. That's why Fry is trying to build up this understanding about criticism, this understanding about how the hypothesis should be postulated. Because when you are asserting this natural phenomenon, that we need not to go beyond the poem, the premature fallacy of premature teleology. And we assert that it's a natural phenomena because it is related with providence, because it is part of your wisdom. Wisdom made it so that if you have certain providences, then you can able to go beyond it. Fry further points out that it is simple as the assertion appears, simple as the assumption appears to us, that this is how the providence is required, because it's part of your wisdom. It takes a long time for science to discover that it is in fact a total intelligible body of knowledge. It is very much difficult for science. It takes a long time for science to find it out. This discovery has not been born as an individual science. You cannot say it is the science discovered that it's an intelligible body of knowledge. It is not discovered simply because of one individual science, but it remains an embryo within the body of some other subjects. It is also part of other subjects. You cannot say it is not with other subjects. It is in other subjects of science that it has to come out of that understanding that it is intelligible source of knowledge. The birth of physics is from natural philosophy, and sociology from moral philosophy. This will illustrate the whole process, that how it comes out of, because everybody is carrying intelligibility in it. cannot say only one individual thing is intelligible. No, everybody is carrying intelligibility in it. And when everybody is carrying intelligibility into it, we need to understand this. Now, it is also very approximately true that modern sciences have developed in order of their closeness to mathematics. You cannot make mathematics away from modern sciences. Physics and astronomy assumed their modern form in Renaissance, in the period of Renaissance. Chemistry in 18th century, biology in 19th century, social sciences in 20th century. If systematic criticism is developing in the fag end of 20th century, the fact is, at least it is not an anarchism. It has to be developed. Fry is saying that now we are looking for classifying principles lying in an area between the 2 points that we have fixed. What are those 2 points that he is discussing about? What are those 2 points that he is carrying on forward? We will discuss those 2 points. We will discuss what he is trying to put in hypothesis, how he is moving ahead with his understanding, and how these archetypes of literature develops. We'll talk it on Monday. Friends, we are going to meet on Monday and continue with the discussion.